Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prosper series. I'm Adriana, and I support Fellow Community. And so our purpose here every week is to envision, ideate, and create a new world of prosperity for all. And if you're new to this series, a special welcome to you. So let's start out. Please share where you are calling in from so we can get a sense of who is in our virtual room today. And I'm here in El Cerrito, California, just outside of San Francisco. Welcome, Victor, from Austria. Wonderful. Seattle, Washington. Great. Germany. Welcome, Suzanne. In New York. Great. Welcome, Natasha. Welcome, Gabrielle. Calling in from Rhode Island. Beautiful. I love the global nature of this community. And so the Prosper series actually began as an in-person retreat, and we gathered in November. This is us in Mendocino, California, developers, designers, dreamers, and doers coming together around this question of how to make money beautiful and create a world of prosperity for all. And so we were intending to bring this back into a retreat setting this year. And of course, with COVID, instead, we brought it online into a weekly series. And so today, what we like to do each week is to begin with a meditation before we dive into our topic. So I invite you, if you feel comfortable, to gently close your eyes and take this time to tune into your breath. Just take a few deep breaths here, breathing all the way down into your belly. Complete exhales, allowing your awareness to come inwards, feeling where your body is touching the chair, the seat below you, and breathing into that place of contact. And noticing how the breath slows and deepens, allowing the body to relax into this holding. And it's in this relaxation, in this space where we have access, more access to our imagination, to our vision. So I invite you to breathe up into your heart. And in the words of Charles Eisenstein, how beautiful can life be? We hardly dare imagine it. So I invite you now to take the time to imagine how beautiful life can be. Noticing what images arise. What does beautiful mean to you? How are you feeling? Who's with you? And how are you all feeling? Allowing the images and sensations to arise. And after your next breath, gently opening up your eyes and coming back into the room. And so we cannot have prosperity for all without racial and social justice. And so I'm super excited to have Robbie Greenfield with us today. Today's actually Juneteenth, I'm sure all of you know, which commemorates the official ending of slavery in the US. And so it's a ripe time to be talking about activism and how that is a major part of creating real social change and how that intersects with emerging technology. So Robbie Greenfield is the CEO of Emerging Impact. He also started the Crypto for Change petition to surface anti-racism and to bring real change into the crypto community. And so with that, I welcome Robbie up to the screen.
Hey, everyone.
Welcome, Robbie. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I really do appreciate it. Excellent.
Absolutely.
So I will take it away.
Please go for
Yeah,
it.
no. Well, wanted to say thank you to just the Cello community, the foundation, C Labs. I know there's a lot of different parts that make up what you all are doing, and certainly appreciate it. And appreciate everyone on the call. I do want to preface today that we'll get into some light topics, but we'll also get into some deep topics. So want to warn you all. There'll be a lot of history and a lot of education. That's really important. That not only relates to today, at least in the Americanized context, because I know some of you all are coming in from around different parts of the world, but then also how it relates to the crypto community and to blockchain technology as a whole. There definitely is a connection across these hundreds of years. So let us dive into it. Alrighty. So if you don't know who I am, which many of you all shouldn't, just a normal guy. My name is Robert Greenfield. I am the CEO of Emerging Impact, which is an organization that supports major NGOs and government agencies to leverage emerging technology in social protection, education, and economic empowerment programming. So that's everything from cash assistance programs that provide aid to those in need, to unemployment insurance programs, and supplemental nutritional assistance programs as well. My background, I've been in the blockchain space since 2011. So a while back then, blockchain as a technology wasn't as much of a conversation. And through the years, coming from being a literal day trader, so yeah, I came in the same way a lot of people get made fun of for coming in now. It's okay with the cryptocurrency part is a very interesting part of the ecosystem. And because of my background in engineering, started to transition toward the blockchain and application development side. And through my time, I've helped develop the social sector practice at ConsenSys, or ConsenSys Social Impact, where we have done quite a lot of work. And this actually gets us into the emerging market side of things. We look at today's world, particularly now when we're in a post-COVID world, we're in a protest world, and we see a lot of these technologies that we assumed work really well. And we're starting to see them fail, which is really, really interesting, because on the other side, right, when it comes to our high technology like dApps or decentralized applications, et cetera, we see those failing too. So the first thing that I wanted to address was, how do we bring in emerging technology into emerging markets? How do we stop using things like Excel sheets or mail or wire transfers to transfer value around the world? Because what we found is those simple services, when we're not in crisis, are taken advantage of, but when we are, they're quite literally the lifeblood of someone making ends meet, right, on the first of the month, right, when rent's due, when mortgages due, et cetera. So we really honed in a focus specifically to help major NGOs accomplish this goal, is to bring in emerging technology into the field. We've worked on 17 different projects across 13 different countries, and these span a whole bunch of different case scenarios, everything from tamper-proof evidence, which very much relates to what we see in the police brutality videos today, all the way to, of course, identity. But today, I really wanted to focus on cash assistance and the idea, right, and the theme of tokenization. As played out of a theme that might be to some of you all, it's something that's incredibly important, and it also gives you a glimpse of the evolution of financial productization, not only in the United States, but across the entire world's diaspora of African lives, or Black lives, known colloquially. Just a few services, that we focus on. We focus on economic empowerment, education, social protection, and climate change. And this is where we really see blockchain having the greatest impact, right? So humanitarian aid, welfare programming, internet access projects, And one thing that I would like to do as a call to action before we really dive into things is there's so many opportunities within the social sector that are being ignored, for tokenized derivatives or securities or whichever. And I really would love for you all, as smart as you all are, and I'm sure y'all are much smarter than me, dive into these issues, right? Because this is where a lot of the work still needs to be done. So I want to give you a quick example, right, of how blockchain technology can map toward emerging markets and where we see the problems and some of the hurdles in terms of doing this the right way. So while I was at ConsenSys, but also in my role at Emerging Impacts, we did a project with Oxfam International. And Oxfam International is one of the biggest NGOs located in over 90 countries. And they do a lot of humanitarian aid work that you've most likely donated to when a natural disaster has occurred in the past. And the one thing that we're starting to see in the social sector is this transition from giving people shirts and water bottles, et cetera, to giving them cash. Because what NGOs are starting to realize is that it's a lot less expensive, one, to give somebody cash, but also it's a lot more empowering, right? There's always been this stereotype, and we see this in everyday life when we see someone who's unfortunate, who may be homeless, and sometimes we're like, well, should I give? Are they going to buy the right thing? And actually, in contrary to popular belief, beneficiaries of cash aid, those who receive cash, they use it in actually an extremely efficient way. They know exactly what they need. And I think a perfect example of this is when the Syrian crisis had hit and many NGOs were sending all these different types of aid. Over 70% of that aid was resold for something that refugee or that person in crisis actually needed. So it really goes to show that we have a kind of a colonial way of supporting people, even though we're in the right mindset to do so. And cash aid, I think, is one of those narrative changes that we're starting to see in terms of how humanitarian aid is carried out. Now, this is to say that cash isn't necessarily really efficient around the world. If you go into places like Venezuela, if you go to places like Vanuatu, which we'll talk about, there are a lot of different laws. There's a lot of different socioeconomic context or natural disaster context that doesn't allow you to use money in a normal way. So a perfect example, in Vanuatu, one of the most disaster-prone areas in the world, people are very they're used to burying their money, right? Their money is plastic so that they can bury it, just in case another natural disaster wipes away their home or destroys a local community center that they make recurrent use of. And in Venezuela, right, we see that the USD completely is illegal, right? And the issue with the local currency is that there is hyperinflation, so it loses value almost immediately. And these are cases in which cash, or at least the local cash, isn't necessarily the best option. But even beyond that, let's say we're in a stable local fiat economy, right, in an emerging market. We have other issues in terms of high ACH fees, in terms of international wire transfers, in terms of geopolitical conflict, where banks will literally hold on to money because they don't want to take the risk of helping people in Syria. And we often see this in Lebanon as well, right, bordering Syria. So all of these traditional issues are what plague cash assistance today. And it makes it really difficult for us to even do the simplest thing, like give somebody across the world $1. And this is where I think blockchain has an incredible entrance, but it also has a lot of hurdles as well. There are issues of user experience. And we all know dApps still have a long way. People, particularly refugees of crisis, do not want to sign a transaction to get money. There's literacy barriers, right? And there are different types of literacy. There's technical literacy in terms of using a phone, turning a phone on. There's reading and writing literacy in terms of understanding what you're reading, and there's numerical literacy in terms of how to understand the value and what numbers represent. And this is something very common when we hear these calls to financial inclusion. These are the hurdles that you have to overcome, blockchain or not, to actually help the other 3 billion people in the world that live on less than $2.50 a day, right? So very, very real issues, and they're much different than writing a Solidity contract or, instantiating, a microservice, right, on AWS. So in this particular case, we took an application, called Sempo that addressed a lot of these issues, and that allowed $10,000 in Australian dollars to be dispersed to 200 families in a way in which they didn't know cryptocurrency was even being used. They could cash out if they wanted to. They didn't need to be literate in order to use it. They could use NFC cards, right? So plastic cards that they could just tap against the vendor's phone. And I think this is a perfect example of the innovation that we need to see from the blockchain community when we talk about financial inclusion. Everything can't necessarily be driven by a smartphone, because in some cases, including this one, people had never even seen a smartphone before, right? That we had to do a class on how to turn it on. And that's not because they're not intelligent, it's because it is a cultural, technical clash in terms of the reality that they live on a day-to-day basis and the many privileges that we have in the West. And this also relates to a lot of operational improvements as well, in terms of 96% faster execution, increased transparency to donors. So this is where we start to see product methodology, right? Product design in terms of developing the technology that's capable of solving a problem, and methodology in terms of this is how NGOs work, this is how governments work to gain community trust and implement some of these solutions on a more regular basis. So how does that relate to Juneteenth and to Black history and to activism? So one thing that's really important and that we also see lacking is, outside of taking, some design notes on what the problem is or understanding how different social sector or public sector organizations work, one thing that we completely lack is cultural efficacy when building our products, right? And this is why it's increasingly important to make sure that you have diverse teams. The people in Vanuatu, for example, they look like me, darker shade. They would be considered Black if they came to the United States, right? And so they want to interface with people who do look like them to create that cultural comfort. And this is something that's a universal truth around the world. You don't go to a different country and try to help somebody if you can't at least speak their language. So there's a lot of cultural comfort nuances in terms of building products that actually work for marginalized communities. And the history of how these products came to be, of how tokens came to be, of how most of traditional financial products came to be, goes back to slavery. And today we're going to get a little bit more specific as to how this relates. And I do want to give a shout out, I don't know if they're on, to Emory, because I took a class that actually gave me insight personally as an African-American man as to how entrenched slavery and racism is, particularly within the context of the West. So we start at the birth of low-road capitalism. What is low-road capitalism? We see it on a daily basis. We see it in our factories. We see it when we see Amazon strikes, when people aren't being treated well in the factories, and we see it a lot in retail, right? There was only a few years ago when we were talking about child workers in Nike factories and Apple factories, etc. And it really focuses in on how much can we exploit low-income communities to increase margins. And this affects wealth equity in terms of how wealth is distributed across multiple different types of people. And in the United States alone, we see 1% of Americans own 40% of the wealth, which is really hard to conceptualize. But imagine $100,000, $1 million in that 1% being what to you or I would see a penny, right, or a dollar. Right, something that is thankfully a lot more expendable. But for most people in the world, that amount of money isn't expendable. And this had a start, right, in slavery, because at the time, Mississippi Valley was actually the Silicon Valley before the technology age. And for those who are abroad, Mississippi is in the American South, right, where that was effectively the capital of slavery, but not the capital of racism. I would argue that racism is pretty evenly distributed across the United States, unfortunately. But during the time, that is where really the world's economic center was. New Orleans boasted a denser concentration of banking capital than New York City. So New York City wasn't even a financial capital in the world during these times. And in fact, slavery is so entrenched in the American, infrastructure, that our dual banking system, the federal, national banking system and the state banking system, actually came out of being able to control the economic parameters of a slave-based economy. And that is the same infrastructure, right, that we still see today. And then lastly, slavery was global, it wasn't local, not in terms of just the transatlantic slave trade, which actually had the least amount of slaves come to the United States, but in terms of how these things were financed. So London becoming an economic capital, New York becoming an economic capital, the creation of loans, right, in a way that could purchase, resources that hadn't been produced yet, all come from the slave and cotton economy becoming more efficient. So we had the lords of the loom, right? So these were people who were wealthy, who had textile factories, who made products out of cotton. We had the lords of the lash. These were slave owners that were torturing out production to create that cotton. And then we also had the lords of the loam, many of which weren't in the US, but were in Europe, which financed the farming expansion of these plantations. And the next thing that we see as we creep toward the Civil War is the need to finance the Union Army to defeat the South, right, to defeat the Confederacy. And at the time, we didn't see the money or the US dollar that we just see today, even though the US dollar still does support many slave owners, and we need to come to that reality. But at the time, we had greenbacks, which was backed by the U.S. government, and then there was this patchwork Confederate currency that had many different types of slaves on it. And you can see on the image to the right an example of that. So in the sense, the war over slavery was also the war of the future economy and essentially of value. And this is when we start to see the very origins of where tokenized fiat or tokenization of value start to come, the grandfather of what that would be. So this bet on fiat currency really was that the Union Army needed funding, and Lincoln actually used an experiment of creating the first fiat money. So money that is determined by value via the government, via the international community, rather than backed on gold or silver, to do this type of financing. And this gained international accreditation from creditors in London, Amsterdam, Paris, all over the world, and would later be cemented, right, in the world economy at Nixon when we came off the gold standard. But at this point, we were not even on the gold standard. And what we see during this time is that brutal whippings rose and fell in tandem with global market performance. So many of the hierarchy structures that we see in terms of corporations, and also a lot of the accounting practices that a lot of corporations use, come back all the way from this time. Slave masters, as much as the South is depicted as really, really stupid, they were actually incredibly due diligent as to how much performance they could get out of their slaves, including to understanding the depreciating value of certain slaves over the lifetime of them being beat and tortured, to using work incentives, right, to increase and control how productivity ebbed and flowed throughout the fiscal year, all the way to making plantation overseers one of the first salaried managerial positions in the United States on a wide scale. So this goes deep in terms of how we work today, right? Your manager, your manager's manager, that organizational hierarchical chart was very much used and very much perfected during this time. And lastly, the textile mill industry created the world's global financial centers, right? So we always view slavery in this way of like, oh, he's a slave owner, they're on a farm, they're doing country stuff, they're making cotton. But there's a much longer value chain that extends off of the plantation into literally Wall Street. And Wall Street was actually called that because there was a wall in which slaves were actually traded on that actual street. So the economic benefit, right, of slave ownership went far beyond the production of cotton into much more complex financial products that were soon needed. And this goes into the cotton industry and the first financial products. So believe it or not, I put out a tweet, recently that, stated that cryptocurrency would not exist without Black people. And the reason for this is that we go through this history of how fiat money actually became to be when it was first experimented. And outside of this particular case in the US, the Chinese did it, I believe, thousands of years ago in an instance. But really during the Civil War and during the Nixon years are when we start to see the real international establishment of using fiat money as a standard. And this went all the way down to the collateralization of my ancestors and many African Americans here and many Black people around the world who do have, slave ancestry, at least for the past, 400, 500 years, in terms of, where that collateral was used. So there was a need, right, for textile companies to get contracts, right, to own production that did not exist yet. And that made farmers, right, so they're like, okay, well, if I have to sell something that I haven't done yet, then I need a new type of contract to do that. So this is where we see the establishment of future contracts. And then we start seeing derivatives, and then we start seeing collateralized loans. And believe it or not, the first collateralized loans, long before the mortgage became such a defining characteristic of prosperity in the middle class in the United States, loans were collateralized by human beings, by slaves. Monticello, right, with Jefferson, that was a property that was financed using the collateralization of slaves. So, CDOs are actually, the descendants of mortgage-backed securities. And this is when we start to see things progress into tokenized securities that we see today, right? This is a continuation of how we can make capitalist finance more efficient. And it starts all the way back here. And we hear, news pundits, et cetera, say, oh man, Bitcoin and all these things are so speculative, right? They don't really have any value. Well, back in the day, the slave market brought so much speculation in terms of securitized markets that used slave collateral that it almost put the entire Western economy at risk. So we really need to understand how much wealth, right, was created, not just in the United States, but in terms of the world with regards to the exploitation of Black people. So y'all talking about tokens, right? We see a lot of the beginnings of plutocratic structures, even in terms of how we govern, right, blockchain systems today. So we see a lot of blockchains moving toward proof of stake, and we see, private token sales. And this is really just establishing the same concentration of wealth that have been built, from time and time again, from century to century, based off of, Black lives. And that's what I mean when it comes to cryptocurrency would not exist today if it weren't for Black people, because it is we are quite literally intertwined with the financial history of how fiat value came to be and how financial products came to be. And what I don't want to see is us using the platforms that we have now to recreate those systems of injustice, those systems of racism, and what we see in cryptocurrency and what we see in governance, right? And what we see in governance token distribution. And what I do want to see are more projects like what we did with Oxfam International, are the projects that Cello is doing in terms of their pilots. And we need to understand which elements of our system and how we understand finance are actually racist and do need to be deconstructed and are actually efficient and need to be kept. I won't go too much into where we are now. This is already outdated because this was around a year ago when I made this slide. So it's even worse now. But this is where DeFi sits in this, global conversation about racism. And I think it's something to keep in mind. And, with that, in conclusion, global financial system would not exist without the oppression of people of color. It's just a historical fact. And as the first financial products, POC inclusion in the tokenized economy is part of our cultural inheritance, right? It's not something that we're asking for. It is something that different products, right, deployed in different places need in order to work, in order to gain adoption, right? There needs to be that cultural similarity, that cultural feedback. And that DeFi is just another iteration of fiat economics, right? It's nothing new. And even 20, 30 years from now, I'm sure we'll see something that's exciting as tokenization is for us today. And if we don't insert ourselves, right, then we're just going to reinvent exploitative economic models to continue. The last example I would give is, if any of you are familiar with the token taxonomy framework developed by the Token Taxonomy Initiative, right? It creates this general template as to the different behaviors different tokenized assets have. And one thing that I found really, really interesting is one of the published behaviors of an asset is overdraftable. And if you all know or have had bank accounts and have been overdrafted and got an overdraft fee, you know how exploitative that behavior is. That's not a natural behavior of an asset. That is something that has been used to tax many of the poor families that constantly are living on the edge right above zero or negative balance. And this is a perfect example that in our tokenized economy today, we are representing and identifying things that are racist when it comes to the new decentralized digital economy that we're trying to create for tomorrow. And if we don't insert ourselves to stop those things, to hire people of color, to make sure that those narratives are inserted, and to make sure that we're checking how we develop and deploy products, then we're really just going to see exploitation, X, right, going into the future. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Robbie, that's amazing. Wow, I'm just kind of sitting with that. I feel like I have a lot of questions, but I want to see if there's folks out here that have questions. We actually have one from Victor. Robbie, what's your take on UBI?
Yeah, so UBI is really interesting, and I think it suffers from a lot of the same stereotypes as cash assistance, which is if you give money to people, they're just gonna stop working, right? They're gonna be like, I don't want any responsibility. I'm just gonna, live a free life. I think there are a lot of experiments that need to be done. They shouldn't be done on a national basis. They should be on a municipal basis, right? So a citywide basis. And they really should work hand in hand with the existing cash assistance programs like housing vouchers, like, food stamps, colloquially known as food stamps, and other programs to see, okay, what is the behavior change? But that really shouldn't be the focus as much, because I think there's a lot of racist stereotypes in, what the behavior of somebody receiving money should be. What really should be the outcome is does UBI economically empower income communities to transition from poverty to ownership, right? And if it does, right, then that's going to have an overall economic positive for that particular community. It's not just about how people are spending the money. But I do think that, cash assistance programs, what we saw in terms of the COVID-19 stimulus check, at least in the United States, that is a form of UBI, you could say, right? Everyone or almost everyone got that check. A lot of people got that check, more than any time in history. But I think certain experiments need to be done in terms of, okay, how is this aid distributed? Are we doing so efficiently? And what's going to be the economic effect in the long term if we distribute something like a UBI? But yeah, it's definitely an interesting experiment.
Mm-hmm. And we also, from Gabrielle, how do you envision activism playing a part in cryptocurrency in building emerging technology?
So the biggest thing is economic empowerment. And I don't see this as much in a lot of the game theory-esque protocols that we see trying to create new value, because I don't think that the user experience is ready enough for layman consumers, right? I know there are a lot of different really cool things like RDI and all these different things, but I don't think that interfaces with the average person, right, who really needs economic empowerment. I would not include myself, in that batch, like people who are, living below the poverty line. They can't really interface, right, with an RDI. Where I see the opportunity in terms of the crypto space and DeFi is the changing of the rules as to what it means to be an accredited investor, so that marginalized communities can access equity and debt securities that they wouldn't otherwise be able to invest in. That is an economic empowerment move, right? Because many communities of color have no equity at all, or any very, very little stock as a part of their passive income. But then the next thing is, getting at the ground floor in terms of a lot of these projects and a lot of these protocol tokens as well. And then that's a matter of education. The last thing I would say more broadly in terms of crypto companies and crypto organizations is you will not achieve mainstream adoption of your token if you do not have people of color on your team, right? And you have to stop looking at mainstream adoption as, you know, the West using USDC or a particular transaction volume across the different exchanges, because most of those exchanges are used by Westernized communities. And it really gets me too, because I've seen so many, you know, foundations, stable coins, et cetera, claim this mission around financial inclusion without understanding that a lot of the world are Black and brown people, right? In emerging markets, if you go there, they're Black and brown, they look like me, right? In the Philippines, in Latin America, everywhere, regardless if they identify as Black, right? And they struggle with the same history of economic oppression and the same issues of education that don't allow them to access things like a USDC on Coinbase, right? Coinbase might even be available in their country. So these are things that you need to take into consideration when you want to achieve true financial inclusion, you know, rather than, you know, what has been called kind of playbook activism or kind of performance activism, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And another question, you mentioned overdraft fee as an example of a mechanism used by banks, right, to extract money from those in poverty. What other exploitative mechanisms do you see being brought forward into the DeFi world? And what mechanisms do you see that are being created or could be created to empower those being exploited today?
So one perfect thing that I've seen over and over again, and I think this is because is token sales, particularly governance token sales. And the reason why I say that is I understand, you know, it is a mechanism to fundraise in part, right? But the issue is that the way that the capital is distributed, you have no chance if you're a low-income person to participate in governance token sales. We see this with Maker, in terms of A16Z and Polychain Capital gaining a great deal of governance through those sales. We've seen it in other sales as well. And what I've been very surprised at is that, particularly for protocols that are preaching financial inclusion, you should have a very high percentage, at least half, right, of those tokens reserved for communities that you have gone to, right? And you have engaged and you've said, this is when this opportunity is, let us walk you through it. Let's, you know, work with community, right, inclusion centers so that people can own this and show them how to own it. And if they can't own it, let's create custody services so that they can own it and we can hold it on their behalf, right? That is extremely important because a lot of these protocol tokens will be very valuable in the future. But the way that they're being issued is assuming, well, if you can get over these technical obstacles, then you're in, and then it's fair. It's like, no, it's not fair, because that takes out all people who are literate, who are not literate, all people who don't have a computer, all people who don't have internet access. You don't have those three things, you're not participating at all. And this is why we see, right, crypto billionaires now, and not many of them are people of color. It's because, like, these people had money before they participated in the development of these different blockchain protocols.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And Tracy asks, data marketplaces, please discuss how it could be beneficial for the general public.
So data marketplaces, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a general question in terms of what type of data. I will focus on the context of identity data in the social sector, because I know that it's been a big thing, is how do you bring self-sovereign identity, right? So self-controlled identity to the masses who, you know, can't, you know, hold on to documentation because they're a refugee of crisis, you know, or otherwise don't have the means to, or put in situations that constantly take those documents away from them. And then, of course, may, struggle with issues of illiteracy, issues to internet connectivity. And one thing a lot of NGOs, particularly the UN, is struggling with is if you create a great blockchain identity program, right? Who is the steward of their data, right? And what does that mean? How is that data exchanged between organizations? Who really owns it, right? Because there's a transition period where technology has to kind of create that self-ownership over time. It doesn't just start from day one. And the reason why I say that in the context of data exchanges is because I fear that is some of the first data that will be exchanged, right? In terms of a lot of the machine algorithms that need data to be particularly potent at solving certain different problems. I don't think that the data, because data exchanges has always been presented in the context that private companies are going to release decades of their own data, and I definitely don't think that's going to happen. I think it's actually going to happen with public data first, and we already see this a freelance style in terms of acquiring public data from marginalized communities today in the protests, right? FBI are tracking activists by looking at their metadata from social media, right? And that's a form of data exchange. The cost, right, isn't them necessarily paying in any particular token. It's them developing a methodology as to how to acquire it and where to determine, where that person may live or where that person may be in the future. And these are things that not only the FBI have been doing, but Google and Facebook have been doing as well. So I honestly think that data exchange platforms should focus less on, I think, the veil of trying to get privatized data from different companies, and more on how do you regulate the exchange of data that's taking place now as these systems come up, and whether that necessarily should be put in a commercial context in terms of selling it or transferring it.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways that people can get involved is the Crypto for Change petition. Do you want to share a little bit about that, Robbie?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Crypto for Change, or Crypto for Black Lives initiative was one that I and others started last week, and it was really an actionable call to what you can do with regards to police brutality, and that's something that happens all around the world, not just in the United States, but also systemic racism. And again, systemic racism is built in the laws. It's built in how we think. It's built into the advertisements that tell you that you should whiten your skin, right? That is what we're talking about in terms of systemic racism. We're not talking about saying the N-word or saying other derogatory statements. It goes far, far beyond that. And what you've seen, right? Systemic racism is financed. So this is a call to action. There's a pledge that you can take, that you can find in the link in the chat. But also, additionally, you can donate, right? You can donate to organizations like Black Girls Code that are teaching young women of color how to become the next blockchain leaders, how to become the next machine learning leaders. The ACLU, which does amazing legal work, especially in the United States, and I'm sure that they're involved abroad as well in terms of civil rights justice, and many other organizations as well. And that doesn't always have to be a donation in crypto. It can be in fiat. Whichever you have, $1 does make a difference. So even if it's literally just $1, especially on Gitcoin in terms of the CLR matching that they have, but I would say if you're an organizational lead in particular, create a diversity plan, share your diversity numbers. I know that there's an innate fear of sharing diversity numbers. I've talked to major companies in the blockchain space within the past week about exactly this. We are not criticizing what your numbers are now if you have a plan to change them, right? If you're a startup that has 3 people, then you're not going to be that diverse. It's okay, right? It's a journey, right? It's a journey. It is you preparing to be successful, which you will when you have 10 people, and making sure that all 10 people don't look like you, right? But for the bigger organizations in the blockchain space, and I call names, Ethereum Foundation, Coinbase, Binance, etc. Like, they have the resources to do this. It is proven that you will be up to 30% more profitable if you have specifically ethnic diversity and sex-based diversity in your executive teams. It's a fact. So if you want to be more profitable, hire people of color, hire women, if you have that ability.
Thank you. And yes, so thank you, Gabrielle, for sharing the Crypto for Black Lives pledge. So you can check that out in the chat. We have a few more questions here, Robbie. One from Nitya. Thank you for explaining the importance of diversity of governance token ownership. Given these assets are typically volatile investments, how do you navigate the balance between consumer protection and open opportunity to own or invest? What is the most ethically and responsible way to provide investment opportunities?
I think through financial education. And I'm not as concerned with the volatility, just because what we see in a lot of these token sales is that's pretty cheap, right? The first token sale of a lot of the different tokens that are worth hundreds, if not thousands of dollars today were cheap. So they usually start cheap. And, at least in an Americanized context, and I know that this is not true around the world, but in an Americanized context, in terms of people like, my people, right, Black people, African Americans, they do have $5 or $10, right, to buy a few tokens, to buy 10 tokens of governance. They need to be shown how to do it, right? They need custody, right? They can't use wallet extensions, et cetera, as great as those tools are, right? So really, it's a user experience problem and a financial education problem than it is, necessarily a volatility problem. Because when they have those tools, they understand how to get it. They understand that it's going to be volatile in the future, but that it's an investment in a way, right? And I don't want to say that too much because I know that, some utility tokens are on the chopping block in terms of being a security, but, but let's be real, right? Governance tokens do make people money, right? There wouldn't be a lot of billionaires if there weren't, some utility tokens that were sold. So that first. Now, how to do that? This is, for EI, we use a product methodology for exactly that purpose. We create educational collateral specific to the stakeholder in terms of what they need to know. They don't need to know the ins and outs of the type of encryption, right, or consensus mechanisms that governance layer has, because they're not participating at that level, right? They just need to know, how do you hold it? What generally does this do? How do you sell it? We'll get to the other things later. And this is true from organization to organization, because I've seen so many conversations where people start off and they're like, well, the blockchain is, and it's like, no, don't stop there. Don't talk about what the blockchain is. Just talk about the benefits that person can get and how they achieve those benefits. And then talk about the other stuff later. And I say that as an engineer, which kills me.
Well, words matter, right? I mean, that's such a big piece of what you're talking about is communication, meeting people where they're at. And the words matter, because if you're not connecting with them around what they care about and where their needs are, then what's the point, right? So if you have any questions, we just have a couple more here, so please enter them in. So from Victor, we have with governance in particular, if the governance token can be distributed more equitably, what can be done to get those without technical literacy involved in decisions that affect the future of network and their interests?
That's an incredibly important. That's an amazingly good question. It's hard. Right, it's there is definitely an imbalance in terms of good governance participation and educated governance participation, and the distribution of those governance tokens to people who have been excluded from getting the education necessary to be good stewards of that governance protocol. Absolutely is an issue with that. I think ways to solve that is you can't just think technical, right? So there are ways to create good wallets. I think Simpo is a perfect example of this in terms of, people who have low, internet access or, low literacy in order to get the tokens. So I don't think that it's much of a technical problem in terms of getting them the tokens. To your point, though, in terms of using the tokens well, that goes into the government's user experience. I think Decred and Dash have done the best job that I've seen in the blockchain ecosystem at this, though not perfect, and that it is understandable, it's easily findable, right? You kind of get an understanding of how to make proposals, how to stake on proposals, etc. This can be simplified. It literally should be, a 3 or 4 button, right, interface, like propose, stake, reject, write the proposal, support the proposal, right? Anything beyond that's too much. Using things like Discord and Slack, I've noticed that those community channels are more for technical people. Reddit is the same way, right? So it's also dependent on which communication channel you use as well. And you should have, if possible, someone who wants to opt out completely out of those because they don't have a smartphone or a MacBook, right? You should offer some really simple updates via online that isn't like an hour long, right? That's like 5 minutes long. This is what happened. These are the decisions being made, right? You need to simplify things, just like you would need to simplify your protocol if you wanted to get a private token holder to invest, right? It's the same thing. You can't give everybody a 100-page white paper.
No kidding. Yeah, going back to meet people where they're at, right? So yeah. So awesome, Robbie. Well, we're going to hop on a Zoom chat for anyone who wants to connect, meet other people that are on this call face to face. This, again, was meant to be a retreat. You know, Prosper is a place to bring people together in community. And so we want to offer that up via Zoom, and I'll share the link here in a moment. Robbie, how can people connect with you? And if they have a proposal, what is the best platform to connect with you on?
Yeah, Twitter. So Rob TG4. So ROBTG4. I'll put it in the chat. You can find me on LinkedIn too. You know, I'm very approachable. I'm not some hot shot. You know, unfortunately, not playing. No. Anybody can reach out. I have calls with people that I've never met before on a daily basis. I love them. I love what y'all are doing. There are over 7 billion people on the planet. I'm not going to save them all. UNICEF's not going to save them all. The UN's not going to save them all. It really takes a collective effort. So I'm sure the things that you are working on or have been working on, you know, are amazing, and I would love to support in any way I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today. This is really just the beginning of a huge conversation, I feel, and a lot of learning for all of us to do around this. And I'm excited to work together in community to make real change and ensure that we are considering all of this and what's the world that we're creating, right? Because we don't want to just perpetuate the old one. So let's connect over Zoom. I'll share the link shortly. And in the meantime, thank you all for joining us today. We will have our final Prosper event next week around community currencies. So you can join us there. The link will be up later today. And may all beings prosper in connection and unique purpose. And we will see you over at the Zoom. I'll share the link shortly. Thanks all.
Cool.